Sorry to interrupt all your fantastic conversations. Hopefully this lives up to expectations because holy crap. Um, so we've got a lot of AI, ML, LLM presentations at the conference this year. Shocker. This one's going to be a little bit different than a lot of the others. Hopefully helpful. I was a little bit worried about maybe doing a live demo or something, so we're not going to do that after all. But I am going to go ahead and tell everyone, if you're not familiar, we have a SQL support user group, we have an Alteryx user group, we have meetings for both of these, and we'll be doing demos and stuff at future sessions there. Okay, so this is going to be all screenshots, kind of walking through specific examples. Also, if you haven't used something like ChatGPT before, it can be very unpredictable. So not great content for a live demo because you never know what's going to happen. All right, so you're here because I told you these things in the presentation description. LMs, you might have even heard people talking about using them as coding support, and we'll talk all about that. We really want to make sure that we're using these new tools as efficiently as possible. Why? Well, the same reason we use every other tool, right? It's supposed to make our jobs easier, better, allow us to focus on the things that we want to do, not the things we have to do. All right, so this is going to be the simplest and most obscure agenda ever. We're going to go there. You know what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you an intro to the intro, and we're going to talk about leverage. All right? Clear? Everyone's on the same page? We all know what's coming? All right. Let's. Okay. So before I get into any of my content, I want to make sure everyone's aware of what else is out there. So a couple weeks ago, a podcast called Practical AI released an episode called AI's Impact on Developers, which I found very interesting. I actually borrowed some of their content for this. Strongly suggest you go check it out. They have other episodes as well, like most podcasts do, and some of those are also pretty good. We have other presentations here, as I mentioned. So after this, we've got Phil and company. They're going to be talking about Introduction to Generative AI. I kind of wish theirs was before mine, so you'd have an introduction and I wouldn't have to do the intro to intro. Tomorrow morning, we have Building Trust and Observability in Machine Learning Models. So that's going to be a little bit more technical. It's going to be about, you already know what a model is. How do we make it better? So the logging presentation, also important for people who are already there. And organization of LLMs, also pretty technical in the weeds. So we've got a lot of detailed content. So hopefully, between this and Phil's presentation, you'll have a good foundation for understanding what everyone else is talking about. And obviously, there's this thing called the internet. If you haven't heard, there are lots and lots of blog posts and videos and tutorials out there about all these things. And some of those are also very good. So if you want to, you could also just go jump into openai.com or whatever it is and torment the chat model. But as you're trying these things out, remember that anything you put out there is always out there, and you never know what they're doing with your data. So be careful. All right, so we're going there. We're going to address the elephant in the room. All right, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's coming for you. And it's coming pretty quickly. I think what we've experienced in the last year or so is definitely only the beginning, and things seem to be growing rather exponentially. So be aware. This is something that is going to change the way the world functions, most likely, right? So a couple years ago, everyone was talking about blockchain. Nowadays, no one cares about blockchain, right? This isn't blockchain, though. This is probably closer to like the Industrial Revolution than it is blockchain. So up until now, we've had all these new technologies. Every decade there's something massive. The introduction of the microchip and all that stuff. But it's always been very technical, very functional. This is the first time we're starting to see technologies that border on creativity. Now, if you know how these function, you'll know that they're not actually creative. They don't create anything. If anything, it's really just creating an average of everything else that it's experienced. But we're starting to see the impact of technology in very creative environments. All right? These models aren't perfect, and just by their nature, they can't be perfect. So they make mistakes. You shouldn't trust them inherently. So be careful. There's been a lot of talk, including that podcast I just mentioned, about how this is going to affect jobs such as a lot of yours probably. People who are working with data, people who are programming. Really up until this point, these have been growing. They've seemed very safe, good outlook. And now we're starting to say, oh, well, now we have tools that can actually do part of my job for me, right? So what am I going to be doing? Well, what? Decade, 2 decades ago, we started hearing about self-service, right, and distributed development ecosystems. I work in enterprise technology. Some of you work in enterprise technology as well, right? It didn't eliminate jobs. It changed how we were organized. We have tools like Alteryx, no code, low code. I still write code every day. A lot of you still write code every day, right? It's changed how we do it. It's changed what we work on. Cloud migrations, right? Everyone's in the cloud now. There were lots of system administrators. Oh, all my servers are gone. What am I going to do? Well, now they're like systems architects and making more money. So there's talk about how these tools, and we're going to show you, they're not great, especially right now, at what they do. But it does resemble kind of working with an entry-level developer, right? And so it's, why are we paying entry-level developers when we can just use ChatGPT for pennies, right? Well, what happens when your senior developers retire? You kind of got to train up someone to replace them, if nothing else. And I'm guessing pretty much everyone here has heard of the Luddites, and I'm wondering if someone could tell me what we learned from the Luddites. No? There's a common fable that goes out that most people seem to have heard, right? They were afraid of technology, right? And it was to their demise, effectively. Well, the real story of the Luddites is they didn't like the technology not because it was taking their jobs, because it wasn't doing their jobs as well as they were. It was creating inferior products, right? So what we're going to see is, yeah, we're going to get something out of artificial intelligence, but it might not be up to snuff. So, like I mentioned, like other tools, you want to take advantage of this. So it's important to know, how can I use this? How is it going to help me? How am I going to adjust over time? Right? So, big thing, if you don't want to do something, try to find a technology to do it, right? This is the keystone of automation, right? Most people don't want to sit there processing data, doing the same thing over and over and over every day, right? So we have something like Alteryx or a stored procedure that does it for us, right? So find something that you don't want to do but have to, and find a way to make something else do it for you. So there's plenty of talk out there about machine learning and all the issues that go around with this. We do have a Slack channel, AI Digital Trust. Lots of good content in there that gets shared. Check it out. Does anyone know the name Timnit Gebru? No? Okay. Co-lead in Google's AI ethics department. Got fired for speaking out about bias in their models. Okay. It's out there, and not everyone wants you to know it. I'm guessing at least some people here are familiar with the downsides of facial recognition and why it's not as prevalent as people thought it would be at this point in time. Right? Training data. Who is it trained on? People that look kind of like me. Right? Who does it not work for? Anyone who doesn't look kind of like me. So we have to think of all these things while we're building the models, while we're using the models. Where are the upsides? Where are the downsides? How can we use it? How should we not use it? Lots of algorithms out there for hiring. What are they trained on? Traditional hiring data. Okay? We know there's been lots of systematic bias over time in hiring processes. All that gets reflected in those models. They were literally trained to be biased. Right? Prosecuting and sentencing also uses models, same problems. So as you're using all these, keep this in mind. As you're building things, keep this in mind. It's data science, statistics, logic, meaning. Consider all of those different artifacts of the data. Make sure you're not doing anything you shouldn't be. All right, so we've got tools like ChatGPT. Is it artificial intelligence? Any votes? In the space race time, this might have been what you thought of as artificial intelligence. Rosie the robot. A few decades later, might have been something more like that. Well, what we're seeing now can seem humans, right? I'm having a conversation with it. In some ways, the conversation is more logical and reasonable than having a conversation with, say, my 8-year-old niece. But you'll also see it makes mistakes. It can identify mistakes, just like humans. It can create, quote unquote, new things, just like humans. It can learn over time, just like humans. It can appear to lie, just like humans appear to. It can appear to convey emotion. Right? These are all things that we've, over time, said were characteristics of artificial intelligence. Kind of like you know it when you see it. But it can also be very useful and also very harmful, just like humans. Here's the thing. These models, they don't actually know anything, right? It's ones and zeros in almost seemingly random strings at times. It doesn't actually understand anything. The words that come out of its mouth have no meaning to it. It's all based on patterns, statistical patterns in training data. So it doesn't know why it says what it says. Okay, so you might have seen in the news, there was a journalist who had a conversation, I think it was with the Bing AI engine, and it was talking about why he should leave his wife and hang out with Bing instead. But it doesn't know what any of that means. Again, that's just things that it saw in the data it was trained on, right? It was trained on the internet. All kinds of crazy things happen on the internet. So generally, we're going to speak a little bit about this later, it doesn't know what it's saying. It doesn't understand what it's saying. It can't tell you why it's saying that. It certainly isn't citing sources. So it can't tell you why you should trust it. So ultimately, it's not actually intelligent. Now, it will likely evolve to look something like Rosie, or I can't remember what the iRobot guy ended up calling himself. And in computer science lingo, it is artificial intelligence, but it's not artificial generalized intelligence, right? It cannot learn on its own. It cannot know what it's saying. It doesn't understand. But really, nobody knows what this is going to look like. You know, a few years ago, if you would have popped out ChatGPT, would have blown everyone's mind. It did 6 months ago, right? So what's it going to look like 6 years from now? Nobody knows. Lots of people speculate. All right, so intro to intros. We're going to go over the very, very basics of what this stuff is. So how do they work? Well, we take training data, and like I said, it's basically the internet. You just point it at the internet, and you say, here's everything we know. Now you know this stuff. So we talk about the Screenwriters Guild or the Actors Guild, the strikes that were going on, right? There were contract disputes, and one of the big issues in those disputes was the use of AI in those fields, right? So if you're a screenwriter and you wrote sitcom scripts for 10 years, right? was it appropriate for those scripts to be used to train the models to replace you? Did you sign off on that? Did you have to sign off on that? No one knew it was going to happen. So there's a lot of talk about intellectual property rights. That podcast talked about, is there some way GitHub can implement a flag on my repo to prevent it from being scraped for AI training, stuff like that. All right, so we take all that data. That's a lot of data, right? If you were at the LROC presentation earlier, like, that was a lot of data. This is so much more than. So you can't just put all that in a database and be like, again, here's the internet. It doesn't work like that. So what you do is you break down the text, the images, into small blocks called chunking. Okay, and the chunk size depends on all kinds of stuff. And then you encode it. Because, again, that engine doesn't know English, right? It knows ones and zeros. And ultimately, that's what this all boils down to. So it's a sequence of ones and zeros, and it just has tons and tons of sequences of ones and zeros, and it starts to identify patterns in those sequences. All right? So you can take that then, and you can do text and image generation. So with ChatGPT, it's text. Lots of other ones that do images, and I'm sure you've all seen even videos now, and they're all kind of funny usually. Often very creepy, because most people have 2 ears, but not in these. And all that is again, it's identifying patterns. So with text, it's seeing a string of letters. It's a sentence, whatever you sent to it. And what it's doing is, if you've used Google Docs on your phone, autocomplete, that's all this is doing. It's saying, what's the next most likely letter given the string up until now? Okay? And it gives you that letter. And then it goes through everything it's done up until then, and it says, okay, now I have this other letter. What's the next most likely letter? And it gives you that letter. So it's one letter at a time. So when you get the response and it kind of looks like it's typing, it's actually kind of thinking as well. It's thinking about every single letter. What's the next most likely letter? With an image, oftentimes, it'll start with just a white block, and it'll change 1 pixel. And it'll keep changing it until it seems like it makes sense in the context of everything else it's seen up until that point. And then it goes to the next pixel. What would this one be? What about the next one? What about the next one? And so it's doing everything 1 piece at a time. There's no bigger picture. Hallucinations. So I'm sure you've all heard of this. There are lots of fun things that happen when you engage with these systems. We call them hallucinations, but really it's just, it goes and gets stuck. But it doesn't stop when it gets stuck. It keeps going, and it says crazy things, it prints crazy things, it draws crazy things. Oftentimes, the more verbose the response is, the more likely it is to get into that crazy loop. So I mentioned it generally can't cite sources. So you're going to start hearing more about RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. And this is basically connecting it to a database that has vetted data, then it could reference in a different way than it references all the training data up until that point. Okay, and this is where you can start to see it can identify this is an appropriate source for this response. Here's the response. Here's where I got this information. So we're going to start seeing more of this, a little bit more trustworthy for sure. All right, so we have this model. It does this stuff. It does some things well, other things not well. Well, that not well stuff, we can fine-tune the models for specific use cases. Right? So there's lots of different ways to tweak it. One is to go in and say, I've got all the, I have ChatGPT up until this point. I'm going to take that entire model, and I'm just going to add some more chunks of information that are specific to my use case. I want it to also know these things. And you can use that to tailor responses, make it more informed in certain areas. And then prompt engineering. So this is a big growth area right now. And it's not just the model that matters, but how you use the model. So with prompt engineering, what you're doing is you're tweaking the language, the way you ask it a question, what you put into that question, so that it gives a more appropriate response to your situation. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. So the user can do it through a front end, Or you can have developers kind of in the middle of the model and the user building an interface which does a little bit of the prompt engineering for the user, right? So you can build a graphical user interface to kind of tweak how and what gets sent to the model for what's typed. All right, so there's different types of models. They have different intended uses, right? So we talked about text versus images. So that's kind of the highest level. You have different vendors and providers. So obviously there's lots of big players in this space right now. They all have lots of different models. There's different versions. They're based on different training data of different sizes. You can port it to different devices. Because you wouldn't want to host all of ChatGPT on a phone app. You don't have enough processing power, right? So they make different variations of the models that have different capabilities, different levels of detail. Versions. So we're going to play with GPT 3.5 today. That is now essentially obsolete. GPT 4 is much newer. And what newer generally means is more training data, newer training data, more capabilities. So when you're using ChatGPT, if you're using the free version, you're using 3.5. Oftentimes, if you ask it a question, it'll say, I don't know. I only have information up until 2021 or whatever it was. So anything newer than that isn't in their purview. Interfaces. So most people probably familiar with the GUI that we're going to look at today. So it looks like a chat box. Well, there's other interfaces as well, primarily the APIs. They have different capabilities, how the messages get sent, what you can send with them, metadata, stuff like that. They have different costs. So if you want to use the API, there's a charge. A lot of the charges are in what you'll call tokens. A token is essentially the more letters you're passing through, the more characters, the more tokens it costs. And so there's usually token limits, just like any API. And there are privacy and security concerns. So sometimes different models have different levels of privacy expectations and even different interfaces. So sometimes if you're using the API, it might be a little bit more private than if you're using a GUI, for instance. Lots of stuff to think about. All right, so cool. That's your intro to intro. And now we're going to get into leverage and talk about what do we use it for? How do we use it? Upsides, downsides. So a lot of your options are kind of just how we used to use Google. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's seen the chart of the computing resources required for a Google search versus a ChatGPT response. But this is where we start to get into kind of blockchain territory. Very processing intensive for these LLMs. There's a lot of resources that go into it. Whereas traditional Google, you're looking at like Elasticsearch essentially. Not a big deal. But we can use it for a lot of the similar things, and because of how it works in the interface, you can potentially get better results. So we can use it for troubleshooting. Don't know about you guys, but every once in a while I get an error in my code. And sometimes I know what it means. I might have experienced it before. And sometimes I have no clue. And so I'll go into Google and I'll say, here's an error. And I'll go into Stack Overflow results or whatever and try to find someone who solved that error and can explain it to me in words that I can understand. But you can also use an LLM and ask it, what does the error mean? And there's a decent chance that it knows. Because again, it's on the internet. And if most of the people on the internet said it means this, they're going to tell you it means this. Okay, so not just what does it mean, but how can I correct it? Right? So we're in another level of logic here. Not only do we have knowledge of what things are, but we know how to fix them, right? Application. And not only how can I correct it, but here's the code that it popped up in. Point out where in the code the error is being generated. Getting a little bit into the creepy territory now. But it's that smart. Again, not intelligent, but smart somehow. You can ask it for advice. Don't remember ever asking Google for advice, really. But sometimes it has a blog or something with good advice. I might ask it how the code can be improved or optimized. So I don't have an error. It's working. Maybe it's slow. Maybe it's ugly. I can ask it to make my code better. And I can give it an objective. Make it better how? What do I not like about it? Maybe someone else sent me some code. I inherited code that's not well documented. I can ask the engine, the LLM, explain the code to me, please. And you can ask it to do that in lots of different ways. It can give you a paragraph. It can send you the code with inline comments, right? You can specify how you want it to tell you. All right, maybe I want to do something, but I don't know which tool or which function does that thing, right? It can suggest a solution. Or maybe there's a tool or function that you're seeing used somewhere else and you want to know more about it. It can also tell you that. Again, if you're using 3.5, if this tool is newer than 2021, if you ask it about qualify in Redshift, it might not know what you're talking about. And we're going to talk about hallucinations. So it doesn't know what you're talking about. You can use it for ideation. So we're getting into the not just the technical, not just the functional, the creative side of things. What are 5 ways to X? Right, fill in that blank. What are 5 ways to answer this question with a query? Or what are 5 different tools I can use to solve this problem, right? A lot of the time, if you ask it to do something, you're going to get a response that might not be optimal. It probably won't work. But if you ask it for multiple ways to do something, you can kind of manually go through and figure out, I like this and this. I'll try those out and just ignore the other ones. So it's really good for creating lists of things. What's a good name for something, or what's a good description for something? I can't count how many times recently someone's used it to create like a mission statement. Right? Like no one likes writing mission statements, but ChatGPT does. It doesn't care. Letters are letters. Using it to name fields, describe fields. Used it for that. All right, so now we're getting into the generative AI, the really, really generative. We're going to actually have it create things that we can use, not just information, but actual objects, assets. So I have a question from a user. They need a report that does something. Give me some SQL that does this thing. It'll give you SQL. Probably won't do that thing, but it'll give you some SQL. And maybe I want to give it a little bit more specifics on what's supposed to be in that SQL, how it's supposed to function. We're going to get into that. So, like I mentioned, it's probably not going to do what you want it to do right off the bat. You can adjust it. You're probably going to have to adjust it. You're probably going to make several adjustments. And you can do those adjustments with follow-up requests. You can start from scratch. Sometimes you need to start from scratch. We'll talk about that. And you can make specific adjustments, like, hey, this field doesn't exist, right? Or it can be a general request. Oh, I'd like this workflow to be structured with more parallel functions rather than sequential functions, so I can, make use of the AMP engine or something. Okay, so just like Google results, not everything it gives you is going to be perfect, but it's something. It's a good starting point. So big one that I wanted to point out, I wasn't really sure where to put this in the presentation, so it's kind of a use case. I would never ask Google to create sample data for me, but creating sample data is one of those things that sometimes you have to do and no one likes doing. And again, that's what you're using these tools for. Things you have to do, you don't want to do. So give me sample data. I want column X, Y, and Z, values that look like this in column A, values that look like this in column B. I want this many records. I want it in this type of format. It'll give it to you. Now, again, we talked about tokens and restrictions. If you ask it for 1 billion student records, you're not going to get it, right? So you have to be reasonable in these requests, but it can be very good at this type of thing. One of the problems, if you're looking for multiple tables, for instance, I want two data sets, and I want them to be joinable in such and such way, you're probably not going to be able to guarantee that once you join them, it makes any sense whatsoever. Because again, it doesn't understand the big picture, right? Okay, so let's get started. We're actually going to get in there. We're going to do this. We're going to start typing buttons. We're going to ask a question. Hey, look, I asked a question. Write SQL to calculate average student GPA by college. Sure thing. They're always so pleasant until they turn on you. So it gives me a description of what we're doing, right? A little bit of active listening going in there. Look at the SQL. Take a minute. Really give it a good hard look. Think of all the reasons this is not going to work. Okay. So also, there's no guarantee this is going to work for you, right? So at the very bottom of its response, feel free to adjust the table and column names based on your actual database schema. It's a good thing to note. Hey, that's what my error was for. Let me know if you have any specific details you'd like to add or modify. Well, ChatGPT, I do have a question. Okay, so yeah, and so you can see they made all this up, right? Like that table, it's not a real table, but it makes sense to it, one letter at a time. So here's my follow-up. Why does this group by college ID? Right, so if we go back here, group by college ID, college name. College ID is not actually used in the select statement, so it doesn't need to be there. Will it hurt anything? Probably not. Will it run? Maybe. Might depend on which database this is. But I'm going to ask it why it's there. Out of all the problems with that response, this is where I focused. And it's like, you're brilliant. I didn't actually need that. Right? So it seems aware. This seems like something a human might say. It seems to know what I'm saying. The group by should actually group by college name instead of college ID. Kind of ignoring the fact that it was college ID and college name. So it's not instead of, it's whatever. But again, doesn't understand the bigger picture. Gives me a corrected query. Thanks for pointing that out. Let me know if there's anything else. Just like a good computer servant. Just like iRobot started out. Okay, well, yes, I have some more thoughts. What if the student GPA is not at the student level, but has to be calculated with class grades, right? So if we look at this query, it's just assuming that we have a student GPA, which in most cases is probably a fairly safe assumption. It's a field you might want to use every now and then. It's kind of important to, graduating and stuff. But let's say we didn't have that. Again, there's problems here. Focus on something that's not there. But it's not a realistic query all the time. So I want it to do more. I want it to go into greater detail. Okay, well, it gives me a little information. We have students, classes, and enrollments. Query might look like this. Oh, this is the same query you just gave me. Well, there was more to this response. So to calculate it, you would need to have a subquery. Okay, so now we have a subquery to calculate the GPA that it was showing me in the prior response. We have an average class grade. We have total credits. Now, some of you probably know there's not enough information here to calculate a GPA. Okay, so we'll see how that goes. More response. This is how you put the subquery in the main query. Cool, awesome. Now I know there's nothing more. I definitely don't have everything I need. This assumes you have a class grade column in the classes table. Okay, thanks for pointing out that assumption. There's a lot of other assumptions you didn't mention, but that one's kind of important because why would you use a class grade at the classes table? Class level data. Classes don't get grades. Students get grades. And then we have an average of an average GPA. So again, I'm going to ignore the fact that classes don't have grades and the student have grades. I'm going to focus on this. We're calculating the average grade, and then we're calculating average. Well, you can say the first one's the student, and the second one's the college. But generally speaking, you don't do an average of an average, and that's not how you calculate the student anyway. So if we go back here, S.average GPA, this is S. There's no column called average GPA. So just, off the top of my head, where are you getting that? Apologies for the confusion. Looks like I made an error. Seems to be a lot of that going around here. If you need to calculate that, you typically need to perform blah, 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 blah. Now, it just added a whole bunch of stuff. Not even necessarily relevant to what I just said, because again, no big picture, right? But we've got a class grade out of 100. Okay, so we're using numeric grades on a 100-point scale. 90%, 85, 20. And we're multiplying it by class credits. Weighted average. This is starting to look promising. That, not so much. We still got a little average there. You wouldn't, why would, no. It's not going to work. Stupid ChatGPT. So it's telling me to do that stuff. Then it's showing me how to put it into the main query. Blah, 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 blah. It doesn't really matter because, again, problem. So I just ask it, why are you taking an average of an average? Okay. Apparently I'm brilliant because it didn't know any of these things. But the key here is I don't need to know what's wrong with it. I just need to know that something doesn't look right and mention it. And then it kind of figures it out. And we're slowly getting closer to what we want, right? Because now it's no longer average, it's a sum. We have two sums. Very promising. Hey, look, we have two sums and total credits divided by grade divided by 100 times credits. Like, that's an actual GPA function. Crazy. There's a slight problem. We still have a class grade. Well, it just told me that grades are often in the enrollments table, but it reverted. So we're going in the wrong direction. Typically, it's improving, right? This is overall an improvement. This structure is more useful than what we've seen up until this point. So again, class grade or students? Oh, hey, look, enrollments. Students get grades in the enrollments table. It doesn't actually correct the query and send it to me, so I'll ask it. Yeah, so about all that, the stuff that I asked for, what has to change there? Okay, well, yeah, here's how that would work now. So class grade, it's starting to look different, right? Again, we're going in the wrong direction. We had a pretty solid GPA calculation 2 questions ago. It was just the wrong source. Now we've lost that logic. Ugh. Other problems, never short on those. Colleges, C. Enrollments, E. Classes, C. We have enrollments. It knows the student grade is coming from enrollment. It's not pulling it from enrollment. I'm just going to reinforce this. You just told me the class didn't have a grade. My apologies. Doesn't sound quite as polite anymore. Now the query looks terrible, right? It's unhappy with me, and it's letting me know. Because now we've got colleges and classes at the same level of the query. They both have the C alias, so that's no longer specific enough. Everything's coming from C. We've ignored students entirely. Like, yeah, there's an enrollments table. I guess we're using it to get the college. I give up. That was the end of that conversation. We had taken a wrong turn, and there was no going back. Sometimes you just have to start again. And when you start again, you want to learn from your past experience up until that point. How you ask matters, right? So we're getting into that prompt engineering territory. Okay. Prompt engineering is probably going to be the last thing that AI does with regards to developing more AI. Right. So this is something that we're going to have to learn to do in order to use these well. This is going to be a high need area going forward. Really is how users are going to interact with the models. Again, you can develop an interface which does prompt engineering. You can train people to engineer their own prompts, to make more specific requests. If anyone went to my presentation this morning, requirements. Even LLMs need good requirements. Okay, well, prompts can be domain or case specific. They probably should be, because again, more specificity, better requests in, better results out. You want to include as much context as possible, right? Tell it what environment you're working in. Tell it what the parameters are. Give it a framework. We talked about use cases, user stories. As a so-and-so, I want to such and such because something else. Feel free to word your requests in that way. You want to provide metadata. What are you working with? What does it have to work with? Well, you might get some metadata from the business glossary. You might describe a business process. That business process might tell you what tables to use to do something. You might use the data dictionary. Okay, I've got this table. Describe it. I have all these columns in this table. Describe them. The more information you give it, the better a job it's going to do. Giving it sample values. Sometimes, right? Again, nothing you wouldn't make public, and you wouldn't necessarily want to give it a list of how many plans do we have at this point, like 4,000 plan codes or something. You wouldn't want to give it all 4,000 plan codes, but you might want to give it a sample and tell it there's more. How you structure and format that content can affect the results. The interface you're using, again, the front end, the GUI, API, can also affect how this all works. All right, so we're starting over. This time, I don't say write a query to calculate student GPA by college. I mean, I do. It's somewhere in here. I promise it's somewhere in here. GPA, and I describe how to calculate a GPA. Grade points earned, weighted by the number of credit hours for each grade, divided by the number of credit hours taken. We've got some RegSec people who are going, it's more complicated than that. But baby steps. New analyst here. I'm also telling it I have these 3 tables, and these 3 tables have these columns. And here's the column names and the column types and what kinds of values are in there. Right? All this metadata, I put in a JSON array. It might appreciate that. I don't know. But all that information kind of helps with a lot of the problems we saw the first time, right? But hopefully, I'm not pointing out all the same problems. Let's see. This is a complex query for joining multiple tables. But here you go. Wow. Look at that. Not terrible. It's even got a CTE. We're like intermediate developer now. I told it I had a grade column and there were letter grades, and it knows, because again, the internet, it actually needs numbers. It forgot about the A+, which I'm pretty sure was in the sample list, so, you know, a little 5-point deduction there. It's calculating the grade points, and it's building this kind of temp table using the CTE. It's got all my joins, and then it's going to go through and do the average by college in the main query body. Fantastic. So much better. Minor notes. So you want to be specific. Well, maybe I don't like the structure. I could ask it to use subqueries or just all in one. CTs versus subqueries, debate that will live forever. You can tell it what you want. How do you want it to create comments? I did ask it to comment the code, and it didn't do that. So, how do you want to format everything? Blah, 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 blah. We're running low on time. So, I ask it, please try again. Don't do this, do this. You forgot about this, and let's make some tweaks. And here we go. Almost spot on. It missed, it said it addressed the comma placement request, but it didn't. But, you know, this is a 99% grade. Well done, ChatGPT. So, how do you increase the efficiency of your interactions? Performing things over and over, use the API. You don't want to go through the chat interface doing that all day, every day for lots of different use cases. Create a system for doing that for you. Send more information. It's a lot easier the more you automate. Integrate with metadata sets such as the data dictionary. That can all be done. There is potentially a cost for the APIs. You got to address that. Again, we're going to do a demo in SQL support. Also one in the Alteryx user group. Data documentation, dictionary, glossary. A lot of the stuff I put in there, you can find the data dictionary. Even the sample values. Formats, automation, 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 automation. User resources, give it more information. Okay, so when I gave it that list of tables and the fields in the table, I only gave it the ones that were relevant. You don't necessarily want to give it more than's required if you can avoid it. One, you're more likely to confuse it because it doesn't always understand that, oh, this is here, but I don't need to know that. I don't need to use it for this. It usually figures it out, but that's not guaranteed. But also, it's just best practice not to give anyone or anything more than you need to. And again, once things start going downhill, just restart. You're not going to be able to take it back, right? Because all that conversation up until that point is now in its memory. It's using all that to create the next response. It's better to just forget about it. And we're going to have some models coming out of the AI acceleration team in enterprise tech. So keep an eye out for those. This was all 3.5. 4.0, as I mentioned, newer, cooler. It's not free, so that's why I didn't use it. It's supposedly much better writing code. We also have things like meta-built code llama. So it's an LLM specifically for writing code and editing code and modifying code and explaining code. So again, that's a model that's more specific to a specific task. It'll be better at it, hopefully. You can also get plugins. So code interpreter for ChatGPT, again, meant to help it work with code better. I would hope that that initial exercise would have been a little bit different with a better model, but that's not as much fun. So some languages are better than others. If you happen to specialize in something that very few people use or, again, talk about on the internet, it's not going to be as good at working with that. So really good at JavaScript, Python pretty good, SQL maybe a little bit less good. If you're running machine assembly code, then yeah, good luck. All right, so I had promised in the description some Alteryx stuff. So here's that. It didn't go well, basically. So it can provide some guidance. Again, what's this tool do? What should I use to solve this problem? How do I put them together? It can help with orders, stuff like that. What settings to use? This is all very descriptive. Okay? It might even be able to troubleshoot a file. So an Alteryx file is just an XML file. You can send it XML code. Again, if you've got your username and password embedded in your data connection, maybe don't send it that. But the rest of the file, potentially. It generally can't create a usable file. So in SQL, it kind of created something we could use. Alteryx file, they usually don't open. And often it's because the tool names aren't what Alteryx knows the tools to be called. We think it might be Alteryx version being newer than the data used to train ChatGPT. Or, again, it's the internet. Are you going to have more information out there about the old version of Alteryx or the new version of Alteryx? it's going to be mostly trained on the older stuff. So its information's a little out of date, and just the way it works, it's not going to open at all. So because it's in an XML file, it's probably a little bit harder to troubleshoot when you get that file back and it doesn't work. And again, Alteryx user group, come check us out. We'll show you all this stuff. All right. Did I actually make it? I sped up a little bit, but it's so close. All right. Thanks, everyone.